treated with respect, and please do so. Mr. Burgess Owens is an author and a retired professional football player for the New York Giants and the Oakland Raiders. He's the author of a number of books, including the 2016 book Liberalism, or How to Turn Good Men into Whiners, Weenies, and Wimps, which offers a history and analysis of the black experience in the United States. He attended the University of Miami, home of the Ibis, blow hurricane blow. Mr. Owens, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I'm going to take a different tack from the beginning. We are at this point, this is not about black and white, rich and poor, blue collar, white collar. We're fighting for the heart and soul of our nation. We have a very, very special country that started with the Judeo-Christian values that allowed every single generation to become better than the last. And that has not ended, that has not stopped until now. We're telling our kids a little bit something different, that they don't have the opportunities that we had. I'm going to talk about some ideologies. And when I talk about them, I'm not talking about people. People change. I used to be a Democrat until I did my history and found out the misery that party brought to my race. So when I talk about these ideologies don't change, people do. We're fighting for the heart and soul of our nation against socialism, Marxism, and the evil that it has brought to us in the stealing of our history. Karl Marx said it best, the father of socialism, an atheist, anti-Semite, and a blatant racist. Yet we teach his philosophy in our school systems today. He said it, the first battleground is rewriting of our history. You steal our history, you steal our pride in our past, our appreciation for our present, and our vision for our future. And every single urban city in our country is now experiencing that loss. Real quick history, because these are things that we're not taught. I'm blessed to be the great-great-grandfather of Silas Burgess. Came here in the belly of a slave ship, sold in Charleston, South Carolina with his mother to the Burgess plantation. An evil, evil man that drove my great-great-great-grandmother either to leaving her family, her kids, or committing suicide. I don't know, she disappeared. But Silas at age of 8, was blessed to be surrounded by men who believed in freedom. Even though they were shackled, they escaped. They went the southern route of the Underground Railroad, facilitated by white and Mexican Americans. And he's made his way out south to Texas. He ended up being a successful entrepreneur, owning 102 acres of land, paid off in 2 years. Started the first black church, the first black elementary school. Pillar of his community, 18 kids, Christian, Republican. His first son was Alpha Omega. Proud American, an example of what happens when any race, any culture is given hope, opportunity, and freedom. It didn't end there, by the way. The history of our black country, of our black Americans, has been stolen from us for decades, almost over a century. Booker T. Washington, 1882, began Tuskegee University. By 1905, it was producing more self-made black millionaires than Harvard, Yale, and Princeton combined. The 40s, 50s, and 60s, it was a black community that led our country in the growth of the middle class. Led our country in terms of the men committed to marriage, over 70%, now it's 30%. Led our country in terms of the commitment to business ownership, 40%, now it's 3.8%. Men matriculated from college. We now have a higher percentage of men incarcerated in college. It is, by the way, my degree was biology. And that, I learned a long time ago that slavery is not a gene in the DNA helix. It's our actions, it's our attitude, it's our belief. I do not believe in reparation, because what reparation does, it points to a certain race, a certain color, and it points them as evil, and points the other race, my race, as one that is not only becomes racist, but also beggars. I do believe in restitution. Let's point to the party that was part of slavery, KKK, Jim Crow, that has killed over 40% of our black babies, 20 million of them. State of California, 75% of our black boys cannot pass standard reading and writing tests, a democratic state. So yes, let's pay restoration. Let's pay restitution. How about a Democratic Party pay for all the misery brought to my race? And those, after we learn our history, decide to stay there, they should pay also. They're complicit. And every white American, Republican or Democrat, that feels guilty because of your white skin, you should need to pony up also. That way we can get past this reparation and recognize that this country has given us greatness. Look at this panel. It doesn't matter how we think. The fact is, well, it doesn't matter our color. We have become successful in this country like no other because of this great opportunity to live the American dream. Let's not steal that from our kids by telling them they can't do it. Thank you.
Our next witness will be the Right Reverend Eugene Taylor Sutton. He's Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland, a position held since 2008. Previously served as canon pastor of the Washington National Cathedral and director of the Cathedral Center for Prayer and Pilgrimage. Bishop Sutton has been a leader of retreats and conferences on nonviolence, reconciliation, and the environment, and has taught at New Brunswick Theological Seminary and Vanderbilt University Divinity School. He is a graduate of Hope College, earned his Master of Divinity degree at Western Theological Seminary, completed his Anglican studies at the University of the South School of Theology. Reverend Sutton, you're recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am here today as a bishop of the Episcopal Church, representing for many a perspective of the faith community in favor of the proposed legislation on reparations. I might say it right at the outset, the debate we are having here this morning and the witness of my colleagues here points to the need to establish a commission. This debate needs to happen, and we need to entertain proposals for how we redress the evils of our past. If we don't address those problems in an open and fair way, then we are continuing to be lost as a nation. By the way, in terms of politics, some of my friends are for Democrats, and some of my friends are for Republicans. And as a religious leader, I am for my friends. I want to say that last month, the Episcopal Diocese of Maryland that I lead, 110 congregations across most of the state of Maryland, voted unanimously for the affirmation of reparations of our diocese, knowing that so many of the resources of our diocese was gained from uncompensated labor of enslaved persons. 100%, not a single negative vote from a diocese that is over 90% white, encompassing people from Western Maryland who have their own history of injustices, coal miners and others, Southern Maryland, suburbs, and city people. How and why did that happen? If it could happen in that diocese, I'm convinced it can happen in America. It happened because when the issue of reparations are fairly and fully explained, Americans want to do the right thing. That issue of reparations is mired in emotion. It's often mischaracterized and certainly largely misunderstood. It wells up an emotional response in people to the word, but when you break it down on what it's actually to do, we find that many of those emotions dissipate. Why is there the need for it? Let me tell you the story of a friend of mine. She and her husband, she was a pastor of a congregation. And a long time ago, she told this story of when their child was young. There was a young girl, a young teenager in the congregation who knew they had a need for babysitting, and she said, "I'll sit for your son tonight." And then she volunteered again. And then my friend and her husband started calling on her more and more. Would you do this? Would you do this? Never was the issue of money brought up. They knew she volunteered at first, but she, the teenager, wanted to do this for that more powerful person in that church. That went on for years. After a while, my friend and her husband thought, this was unfair. This actually was an injustice toward her. They wrote her a letter, now in college, and they said, we have come to know that this was an injustice. we are sorry. We want to make amends. The young woman wrote back, thank you. And then they worked out a way that she could be compensated for her years of work. Their relationship was reconciled. They could look each other in the eye in a way that they could not before, because that wall of injustice of that past got in the way of their current relationship. That's what reparations is. And that's what our nation has failed to do for the last 120 years. Reparations, quite simply, means to repair that which has been broken. It is not just about monetary compensation. An act of reparation is an attempt to make whole again, to restore, to offer atonement, to make amends, to reconcile for a wrong or an injury. It is not the transfer of money from white people to black people. It is what this generation, our generation, will do to repair the broken pieces of the racial mess that we have all inherited. As an African American who is a descendant of slaves who were never compensated, I can honestly say to all white people, we've forgiven you. We forgave this country a long time ago, and we continue to forgive every day, but we are not reconciled. To reconcile means to put back together again that which has been broken. After the hard-fought abolition of slavery, there was a fateful denial in our nation of reparations for freed African-American people, even though in many instances, white plantation owners received reparations in the form of compensation for the losses they incurred from the Civil War and the end of slavery. This nation is not, we know about reparations, it's just that it's never been done for those who've deserved it the most. Finally, I'm a Christian. That means I hold to the Holy Scriptures of the Old and New Testaments as my guidepost and to the teachings of Jesus. The Bible mandates that leaders are to be held accountable for the fair and equal treatment of every inhabitant in the land. All of us have been taught to love everyone, regardless of their race and human condition. However, we must come to acknowledge that there can be no love without justice, and there can be no justice without some form of repairing an injustice. I hear from many of my white friends, white brothers and sisters, this question: what do black people want? Haven't we done enough? What do they want? I want to turn the question around. What do you want? What kind of America do you want to live in? If you are happy with the state of race relations now, don't do anything on this issue. But if you want a reconciled nation, let's get this commission and let's entertain those proposals.
Thank you very much, Reverend. Before I recognize our next witness, I want to recognize a member of Congress who's here, Representative Frederica Wilson from Florida, and we appreciate your attendance. Our next witness is Dr. Julianne Malveaux. Dr. Malveaux is a labor economist, noted author, and frequent media commentator. She wrote a weekly column for more than a decade that appeared in newspapers across the country, including the LA Times, the Charlotte Observer, the New Orleans Tribune, Detroit Free Press, and the San Francisco Examiner. Hosted television and radio programs and appeared widely as a commentator on networks including CNN, BET, PBS, NBC, ABC, Fox News, MSNBC, CNBC, C-SPAN, our favorite station, and others. She also served as the 15th president of Bennett College for Women, America's oldest historically black women's college, received her PhD in economics from MIT and her bachelor's and master's degrees from Boston College. Thank you for your coming, and you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Chair Cohen, thank you so very much for this opportunity. I also want to thank my sister friend, Congresswoman.
The mic may not be on.
Okay, sorry about that. What do I have to do?
Talk.
Yeah.
Okay. I want to thank my sister friend, Dr. Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, and my twin sister over there, Congresswoman Karen Bass. People frequently comment on our resemblance. And of course, Congressman Nadler, for your work and your leadership, Keenan, and Dr. Ron Daniels, who is here and has been mentioned for his leadership of NARC, the National African American Reparations Commission, on which I serve. I am delighted to be here because this hearing is not on time, it's like overtime. It's more than time for us to deal with the injustices that African American people not only have experienced in history, but continue to experience. I'm an economist, so economics is a study of who gets what, when, where, and why. It's a study of the way the factors of production are paid. The elements are land, labor, capital, and the secret sauce. Some people call it entrepreneurial ability, some call it creativity. Land gets rent, labor gets wages, capital gets interest, and the secret sauce gets profits. But the work of predatory capitalism is to figure out how to extract more from the factors of production toward capital and away from people. And we've seen that in the past 3 decades with our own economy, but more importantly, enslavement was about the devil's work of predatory capitalism. Indeed, enslaved people got no wages, and we represented capital for other people. And so after enslavement, first of all, enslavement was the foundation on which our country was built. So anybody who says, well, I didn't have any slaves, no, you didn't have to have any. What you had to do was experience them, enjoy the fact that they were here, enjoy the fact that their labor made it possible for there to be a Wall Street, a bond market, and all of that. But beyond that, I want to speak specifically to Section 3B3 of the legislation. That's a part that talks about the federal and state laws that discriminate against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who are deemed United States citizens. From Robert Higgs in a book called Competition and Coercion, Blacks in the American Economy, 1865 to 1914, he shows that in 1880, the ratio of black to white wealth was $1 black dollar for 36 white dollars. 1890, 1 to 26. 1900, 1 to 23. 1910, 1 to 16. Today, 1 to 20. In other words, we're almost worse off in 2019 than we were in 1910 because of evil. Because basically there have been deliberate attempts to marginalize African American people, especially those who are formerly enslaved, because of the interests of predatory capitalism, and because it was expedient to maintain the status quo of having free black labor and to prevent wealth accumulation. Despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, black people were treated as other and perniciously and viciously excluded from the possibilities of economic advancement. The Emergency Land Fund documented the reduction of black land ownership between 1910 and 1969 from 16 million acres to 6 million acres. How and why? Land grabs, tax schemes, faulty deeds, and downright force. My own family in Moss Point, Mississippi, experienced the expropriation of land through a moving fence, like the fence moved one night. We used to have the land, and we didn't have the land. Years later, after a couple of cousins were lynched, they changed the name of the land to Hawkins Lane, so they named it after us, but we didn't get it back. Joseph Brooks in 1978 estimated that black folks were losing 6,000 acres of land per week. And we saw what happened with the Agriculture Department. The post-enslavement case for reparations can be made by examining racially hostile public policy and government complicity to white supremacy. You all have an article that I wrote for the ACLU that talks about several cases, Memphis, Wilmington, North Carolina, Tulsa, Oklahoma, but these were the tip of the iceberg. This happened everywhere. The journalist Ida B. Wells said that lynching was the first example of white supremacy because it was a tool of terrorism. It dampened the ability of African American people to participate in the vibrant entrepreneurship of the late 19th and early 20th century with a chilling message that our economic success could be punished by the rope. The economic damage to black people post-Reconstruction can be summarized in 3 ways. Number 1, we were denied the ability to participate in our nation's economic growth. The Homestead Act of 1862 did not include formerly enslaved people. More than 10% of the continental U.S. land was distributed to recent immigrants from Europe, but not black folks. So the 40 acres and a mule was given to somebody else, not us. These folks were able not only to get land, but then to get grants from the federal government to develop their land. Meanwhile, African American people were denied the right to these wealth transfers. Secondly, we were denied the right to accumulate. The paper that I mentioned talks about how our accumulation was essentially stymied by lynching. The first lynching that Ida B. Wells examined was one when a black man had the utter nerve, to open up a grocery store near a white man's store. So the white man had a brother lynched, had 3 people lynched because of economic envy. Listen to those words, economic envy. This is how black people have been suppressed in their ability to accumulate. Tulsa, Oklahoma, Wilmington, North Carolina, long stories, and I don't have any time to talk about them. But I want y'all to look at the paper that I submitted and to think about the many ways that black people who tried to participate, tried to encourage, tried to be American, simply tried to be economic actors, were suppressed because they had the nerve to think it worked. So my brothers over here who say their American dream is some people's American nightmare. Let's just be clear. Now, number 3 is public policy hostility. There's public policy hostility to black people. GI Bill legislation truncated opportunities for African American veterans. Federal Housing Administration reinforced redlining and segregation as an official policy of the federal government. People talk about racists as if they're individuals. Yes, sir. But the fact is they're not individuals. They're individuals who are buttressed by the federal government and legislation. So let me simply say, H.R. 40 is important. NARC has developed a 10-point plan, but more importantly, as you, my brothers and sisters on this Congress, go forward, may there be a racial justice audit of any new legislation that has economic implications. Thank you.
Our final witness is Professor Eric Miller, professor of law at Loyola Law School in Los Angeles. Number of law teaching positions since 2003. He's written a number of academic pieces on reparations, among other topics. Testified in December of 2007 before this subcommittee on the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade in America. Professor Miller received his Bachelor of Laws with first-class honors from the University of Edinburgh in the UK, his Master of Laws degrees from Harvard Law School, and he's held a number of fellowships. Professor Miller, welcome back. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, I am honoured by the committee's invitation to testify at this very important hearing on H.R. 40 and the path to restorative justice. I will speak to my experience as an academic studying the issue of reparations and as a lawyer representing the victims of the Tulsa massacre of 1921 in a reparations lawsuit against the state of Oklahoma and the city of Tulsa. In the short time available, I want to make the following points. Local, state, and federal governments were active perpetrators of race-targeted discrimination against and domination of African Americans during slavery and Jim Crow and beyond. These governmental institutions engaged in the massive social, political, economic, and cultural destruction of African American communities. Many of the perpetrators and victims of race-targeted state action are readily identifiable through a thorough investigation of existing historical records currently in the hands of public and private institutions. The race-based disparities brought about by federal, state, and local government discrimination remain baked into our governmental institutions, as well as the persistently segregated private social ordering those institutions brought about. Reparations addresses the ways in which these institutions entrenched race-based discrimination and domination throughout American social, cultural, economic, and political institutions. The committee should consider specific legal remedies to remove the time-limited bars against litigation, which are the major impediment preventing identifiable victims of extraordinary race-targeted state action to sue state and federal governments for financial damages. There have been multiple reparation-style lawsuits brought since the Supreme Court decided City of Richmond versus Croston, which have survived constitutional challenge. But reparations must also include rebuilding the social, political, economic, and cultural infrastructure of the communities destroyed by the state. Because without social, cultural, and political reparations, race-neutral programs of economic uplift will preserve the relative social and political disadvantage, domination, and disempowerment of African Americans across this nation. The urgent need for the H.R. 40 Commission and reparations as a path to restorative justice for the victims of state-sponsored racial injustice became clear to me in 2003. That's when I joined the Reparations Coordinating Committee, a group of lawyers led by Charles Ogletree and Adjoa Ayatoro. Our legal team filed suit representing the more than 125 still living survivors of the Tulsa, Oklahoma race massacre of 1921. Now, some historical context is in order here. On May 30th, 1921, some African Americans mobilized to stop a lynching in Tulsa, Oklahoma. One lynching had an effect on a whole community, because in response, white citizens deputized by the police and aided by the State National Guard burned down the 35 city blocks of Greenwood, a thriving African American residential and business district in Tulsa. Up to 300 African Americans died in the massacre and ensuing fire. Overnight, 5,000 African Americans became homeless. 3,000 terrorized people fled the city. The rest were rounded up and held under guard for days at the local baseball park and fairground. The Red Cross had to mobilize to provide tents for those who remained. The city of Tulsa and the state of Oklahoma moved quickly to suppress news of the massacre. Survivors were terrorized into silence. All mention of it was excised from official accounts of Oklahoma history. The details of the massacre only became public in 2003 after the state of Oklahoma formed an H.R. 40-style commission, including historians, lawyers, and activists, to report on the massacre. The commission's painstaking research through the historical record discovered much previously unavailable material. The commission apportioned detailed financial damages and proposed that reparations be paid to the survivors and descendants. When the state refused to make good on these recommendations, we filed a lawsuit trying to complete the process begun by the Commission. The only impediment to our success, the court acknowledged, was a rule requiring the survivors to file any lawsuit within 2 years of the injury. These statutes of limitations are the major impediment to many reparations lawsuits. The Tulsa experience demonstrates that the harms of slavery and segregation scar our communities to this day. The city and state dismantled economically, politically, and culturally a specific community, African Americans in Tulsa. Subsequent generations of Greenwood residents have labored under the social and political disempowerment whilst trying to rebuild their community. The Tulsa experience is emblematic of many African American communities around this country. So whilst a monetary payment would count as a beginning, economic justice is not enough without racial justice to repair the specific race-based wrongs of the Tulsa massacre and its aftermath. To quote Harvard law professor and reparations activist Charles Ogletree, reparations are more than an exercise in education, remembrance, and apology. Reparations demand the political, social, and economic power and equality for African Americans that has been stifled and suppressed in America since its inception. Accordingly, I urge Congress to pass H.R. 40 as a first vital step on the path to acknowledging and accounting for the history of race-targeted discrimination and wrongdoing that has marked too much of this nation's history.
Thank you, Professor Miller. We will now proceed under the 5-minute rule of questions, and I will begin now by recognizing myself for 5 minutes. Mr. Tanahashi Coates, in your article, The Case for Reparations, you state 250 years of slavery, 90 years of Jim Crow, 60 years of separate but equal, 35 years of racist housing policies. Until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole. Why should the federal government bear responsibility for economic and social damages to the descendants of the enslaved?
Thank you, Chairman Cohen. I think the most obvious reason is because the federal government is complicit in it. The article that you spoke about, this period of white supremacy that you referenced in the headline, it is so broad that if I tried to cover it in one article, it would have been impossible. So I focused on a very specific thing, and that is the period of Jim Crow and housing segregation and redlining, specifically in the city of Chicago. The federal government should pay because the federal government was deeply complicit in housing segregation and redlining and in the plunder of black homeowners in Chicago. It would not have existed if the FHA had not had a policy of not insuring loans for black people living in Chicago. It would not have existed if not for the redlining maps, which were written and created by this government of every major city in the country, which effectively relegated black people, whether they had a down payment or not, outside of a class of people who could benefit from a movement which basically created our modern middle class. And so I don't know how it would be possible to exempt the federal government from such a process. And furthermore, I have to make this point over and over. Many of the people who were victimized by housing segregation and by redlining are very much alive today. So this is not strictly about the past. This is identifiable victims, as Professor Miller said, who are there and who are ready to be part of the process.
Thank you, sir. Reverend Sutton, let me ask you, you heard Mr. Hughes' testimony and said he didn't want reparations. Yes. Do you believe, and this would be a study of reparations, H.R. 40 draws no conclusions, it would be a study, do you believe that there should be exclusions for wealthy folks who have been successful and maybe emphasize deeds and works and actions that help the people who have not achieved as much and lift them up?
I believe that one of the reasons why it was so widely accepted in my diocese is I believe one of the reasons why the vote for reparations was so widely accepted in my diocese is because we separated it from black descendants of slaves getting checks. We're talking about funding initiatives, programs, addressing issues such as mass incarceration. And when that's explained to people that that's a reparation, that's repairing something that can be traced to slavery, then that is the case. Personally, I'm not looking for a check from the federal government or from my church or anything. I'm concerned about those who have been left behind, the masses of African American descendants of slaves who are mired in hopelessness and despair in communities of crime, violence, poverty, and racism. And so I think if we can at least have a civil, good conversation on the concept of reparations, then talk about money. Because the moment you start talking about money, the idea, especially among many white persons, I'm going to give a check to black persons, what about me? The moment you begin with money, then the resistance goes up. Let's talk about the concept. Finally, in relation to your question, we have a problem in this nation of being able to talk civilly about race. And when I'm talking for reparations, I'm talking about those left behind, but I'm actually talking to my white brothers and sisters. You need this more than we do. You need this for your soul. You need this to be able to look black persons in the eye and say, I acknowledge the mistake, and I want to be part of the solution to repair that damage.
Thank you, Reverend Sutton. And as Reverend Sutton speaks to the soul, Dr. Malvo, you speak to the economics, and if some of this efforts to remediate the past, as Dr. Ogletree had spoken about, massive influx of monies for health and education and job training, if some of that went into areas where there are large concentrations of descendants of slaves that have not succeeded for a myriad of reasons, and if some of that went to white folks who are there who also are living in bad conditions, would that be a problem, do you think, Dr. Malvo, or would that just be helping everybody that's in a miasma?
Chairman Cohen, it's really interesting that right this minute, as we're having this hearing, Reverend William Barber is having a hearing on poverty. Mm-hmm. So this is a great day for economic justice issues. Poverty is a problem in our nation, but you can't fix poverty, nor can you fix inequality unless you deal with racism. And dealing with racism is about dealing with reparations. I'm with the Reverend here, and I don't care about a personal check made out to Julianne Malvo or anybody else, but how about we fully fund our historically black colleges and universities? How about, once upon a time, Brother Chairman, we had more than 100 black-owned banks. Now we have 23. How come? Again, the devil is busy. Pernicious legislation that basically caused people to lose banks, changing in reserve requirements and things like that. Gentrification, while you have empty swaths of land all over our nation, why not deal with that? So I respect your question about areas, but I think that really does speak to our dis-ease, our uneasiness in talking straight up front about race. Race is our nation's second original sin. The first was what we did to Native people. Okay, but racism, enslavement was our original sin, and we got to deal with reparations by dealing exactly with that. If we want to have an American Marshall Plan that deals with all poor people, Reverend Barber says there are 140 million poor people, 43% of our nation. Let's deal with that, but let's not forget that race is central to anything we do around economic justice.
Thank you, Doctor. My time expired, and I recognize the ranking member, Mr. Johnson, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you to all of you for your time and your heartfelt sentiments, and we know they're sincere. Mr. Hughes, I want to thank you for your honesty and your humility and your courage, sir. I know this isn't easy today. Here's a big question that hangs over all this and that all of us need to, I guess, address. Look, many people believe, on all sides of the political spectrum, that racial inequality that we see today is not entirely attributable to the legacy of slavery and Jim Crow. It's a factor, but it's not entirely attributable. Can you elaborate on what some of the other causative factors may be?
Well, the first thing I would say is that blaming slavery and Jim Crow for the entirety of racial disparity, obviously it's clearly a factor, but blaming it for the entirety of the problems we see today facing black people is actually a way of not taking responsibility for policy decisions that were made just in the last 50 years. Our prisons did not balloon until the 1980s. Unemployment for black and white youths were virtually identical until the late 1950s and early 1960s. So perversely, by blaming slavery and Jim Crow for everything, we actually fail to take responsibility for policy decisions that were made on both sides of the aisle in very recent history. Secondly, I would say that there is a naive assumption that wherever there is a statistical gap in outcomes between two groups, that gap must be attributable to some kind of discrimination, whether that's overt or whether that's structural and systemic. That assumption is not true. Okay, I'll give one example, but I could give dozens. According to 2015 census figures, there's a 21 cent on the dollar gap. It's 21 cents on the dollar gap in household income between white Americans of Russian descent and white Americans of French descent, right? Disparity is the norm, not the exception. So the question is not why two groups would have different outcomes, whether it's for wealth, income, or incarceration. The question is why we would expect any two groups with different histories, different geographical patterns, different patterns of migration, different cultures, to nevertheless get exactly the same outcomes.
Thank you for that. Mr. Owens, thank you as well. And I was moved by your testimony about the fact that we're fighting for the heart of our nation. I think everybody in this room, as part of the American family, understands that. We see it different ways. Here's a question. In your opinion, is there a formula that allowed the African-American community to achieve the measures of success during the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that is missing today?
There is, and I'm going to point to Booker T. Washington to tell you what that formula is. But first I want to set a few things, square a few things away. I've been talking about restitution a little bit ago, and I have so much respect for the black men and women who built that great Wall Street, little side out of Tulsa. Not only did they had 60 millionaires, they had international business. Within 12 hours, it was destroyed from the air by Democratic KKK. Weren't a lot of white, I mean, they're white people, yes, but they're part of a certain party. The 40 acres and a mule, that was actually implemented. But when the Democratic president, Andrew Johnson, took over, they took that land back. They took away the guns, and then they took away their land. KKK, that's not a Democratic Party, by the way. They lynched 4,700 people. 1,300 of them were white Republicans. So yes, we have a lot of evil going on, but let's not broad brush this, guys. There's a certain ideology, there's certain people that belong to a certain area, a certain niche. We need to hold them accountable, and so let's do that, and I think we're in good shape. Booker T. Washington had 4 foundations. It was head, heart, hands, and home. In that process, head is education, heart is compassion service, hands is industry, entrepreneurship, home is family. The reason why my race were kicking butt, the history is not being told. They were beating, they were so busy They weren't looking at finding somebody to blame for where they were. They were busy beating out these racists. That's what my parents did. At the end of the day, they held on to those principles for decades until the socialists and Marxists got into our community and they stopped educating our kids. I said something earlier, and it has not been a gasp. 75%, 2017 Department of Education study, 75% of black boys in the state of California cannot pass standard reading and writing tests, and you wonder where they're going to go from here. They're not going to learn anything about our country. They're not going to read about our God. They're going to hear anything about what we, the people, have done together. They're going to turn on BET and hear how bad they're being treated. They're going to hear how bad our country is, how bad white people are. They're going to be taught how to disrespect our women, and they're going to be put in jail, and then we're going to sit around talking about why is this being done. Let's put a commission together. Why is this happening where so many of our kids are not being educated in every single urban American country and city in our country? That is what our problem is. As we hold harm and we blame people from years ago, we have yet to put together a commission. How about this one? 82% of black teen males across our country the last 8 years, unemployed, soon to become unemployable. 93% in our liberal city of Chicago, where they were killing each other right and left. And there's not one commission, not one peep about this misery that's going on in our country. I have something that I put in my book. I'm going to read this real quickly. Evil is purposeful stealing of the hopes and dreams and future of an individual. Pure evil is the target of a race of millions and using human misery as political strategy to steal their hopes, dreams, and future. We are dealing with pure evil. To have my race dealing with the evil, the misery that we've been dealing with, and no one says a word other than let's look back and see what can happen for 200 years ago. Let's deal with the day, and I think we'll be in good shape.
Thank you for that. I'm out of time. I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired. Thank you very much. The chair.